The ground opens beneath a pale Levantine sky, exposing a hollow in the limestone where fire once burned and human hands once shaped stone. Around it lies a landscape that seems familiar only from a distance: low hills, open grass, scattered woodland, and water gathering in the basin below. Herds move through the changing vegetation. Dust rises in the dry months, while colder seasons bring rain and mud across routes linking Africa, Asia, and Europe. Somewhere in this landscape, between roughly 140,000 and 120,000 years ago, a human population lives whose identity will remain hidden for more than 100 millennia. What survives of one individual is almost nothing, a portion of skull and part of a jaw, yet these fragments will disturb one of the most carefully arranged stories of human origins. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The mystery beginning here is not built around a complete skeleton, a preserved face, or a cache of ancient DNA. It begins with absence. The brow, forehead, chin, and most of the teeth are gone. There is no name this person would have recognized, no burial inscription, and no image that can restore an expression. Even the scientific label eventually attached to the remains, Nesher Ramla Homo, is not an official species name. It is a cautious description for a proposed population, a way of marking a combination of traits that appears difficult to place within familiar categories. From a handful of bone, researchers must decide whether they are seeing a lost branch of humanity, a regional form of another known population, or simply variation that the fragmentary fossil record makes seem stranger than it was. The individual occupies a dangerous moment in prehistory. Homo sapiens already exists, and members of our species have repeatedly entered the Levant from Africa. Neanderthals are established farther north and west, with populations stretching across Europe and parts of Western Asia. Older human lineages have not necessarily vanished cleanly when newer forms appear. Instead, populations expand, retreat, meet, separate, and sometimes exchange genes or knowledge. The Levant is not merely a bridge crossed once during a triumphant migration. It is a broad, shifting contact zone. Climate opens green corridors and later closes them. Deserts contract, then return. Animals follow water and vegetation, while human groups follow animals, raw stone, shelter, and opportunity. Every movement creates the possibility that populations described as separate in textbooks were sharing the same region. For much of the 20th century, human evolution was often represented as a branching tree whose limbs could be named and followed with reasonable confidence. Earlier forms gave rise to later ones. Distinct species occupied distinct territories. Modern humans eventually spread outward and replaced the rest. Discoveries in fossils and genetics have made that picture far less orderly. The tree now looks more like a braided river, its channels dividing and reconnecting across immense spans of time. Neanderthals contributed DNA to many living people. Denisovan ancestry survives in populations far from the cave that gave these humans their scientific identity. African population history also contains deep divergences that cannot be reduced to a single ancestral community. Nesher Ramla enters this increasingly tangled picture not with genetic proof, but with anatomy that refuses to sit comfortably in one box. The preserved cranial fragments possess archaic characteristics, including a low, flattened form unlike the more rounded brain case typical of Homo sapiens. The jaw is robust and lacks the distinct projecting chin associated with modern humans. Other details invite comparison with Neanderthals, although the remains do not display every feature expected in a classic European Neanderthal. This mosaic matters. It suggests either that an archaic population persisted in the Levant surprisingly late, or that Neanderthal variation extended farther south and took forms that the better-known European fossils do not fully represent. Scholars still debate which explanation fits best. The evidence remains incomplete, and a partial skull cannot bear the weight of every claim placed upon it. What makes the puzzle more unsettling is the archaeological world surrounding the bones. The humans at Nesher Ramla were not stranded relics mindlessly repeating crude behaviors inherited from a remote age. They used sophisticated stone reduction methods associated with the Levallois tradition, planning the shape of flakes before removing them from carefully prepared cores. Comparable techniques also appear among contemporary Homo sapiens in the region. Stone tools alone cannot reveal who taught whom, whether the groups met directly, or whether similar methods developed through longer networks of cultural transmission. Yet the resemblance weakens any simple assumption that anatomy and behavior advanced together in a straight line. A person with strongly archaic skeletal features could participate in a technical tradition as organized and flexible as that used by people whose bodies looked more like ours. Seen from the ancient basin, this should not be entirely surprising. Survival does not depend upon belonging to a category invented thousands of generations later. It depends upon reading a landscape, locating good stone, controlling fire, anticipating the movement of prey, and carrying knowledge from one season to another. The inhabitants leave butchered animal remains and evidence of repeated activity. Their world requires judgment, memory, cooperation, and skill. Whatever their precise biological identity, they are not evolutionary shadows waiting to disappear. They inhabit their own present, surrounded by choices whose urgency is immediate. A tool edge dulls, fuel burns down, herds change direction, rain alters the ground. Another group may appear beyond the basin, carrying familiar objects in unfamiliar hands. That possibility gives Nesher Ramla its wider significance. If archaic humans and Homo sapiens occupied the Levant during overlapping periods, then encounters become plausible, although no surviving artifact records a particular meeting. Knowledge may have moved without populations merging. Individuals may have crossed between communities. Groups may have avoided one another, competed for the same resources, or returned to the landscape generations apart. No single explanation fully accounts for the anatomical and archaeological pattern. The temptation is to turn possibility into a dramatic scene, but the more honest mystery lies in how much cannot be recovered. Similar tools are evidence of shared technological concepts, not a transcript of conversation. Proximity is not proof of coexistence at one hearth. Anatomy can suggest relationships without revealing personal identity. Even the word population must be handled carefully. The fossils known as NR1 and NR2 may belong to the same individual, leaving scientists with an exceptionally narrow window into a much larger human presence. A population cannot be fully described from one person, especially when much of that person is missing. Differences that appear taxonomically important may represent geography, age, sex, ordinary variation, or inheritance from several ancestral groups. Conversely, dismissing the remains as merely unusual could conceal a long-lasting Levantine lineage whose fossil record has survived only in disconnected pieces. Other contested remains from the region may eventually belong within the same story, but linking them requires interpretation, not certainty. The figure at the center of this mystery therefore remains faceless. There is no reliable reconstruction of eyes, nose, hair, or expression. What can be imagined with greater confidence is the setting limestone underfoot, smoke drifting from controlled fire, sharp flakes accumulating beside worked cores, and animals moving through a corridor repeatedly transformed by climate. In that setting, familiar human labels begin to blur. A being with an archaic skull applies a technology also known to Homo sapiens. A southern population carries traits associated with humans better documented in colder northern lands. A Crossroads preserves not one clean migration, but traces of repeated presence. Far beneath the modern surface, the fragments wait while entire climates pass over them. The basin fills. Sediments gather. Species alter their ranges, and human populations disappear, merge, or move beyond recognition. When the bones finally return to daylight, they do not reveal a missing name. They expose the weakness of the boundaries drawn around the ancient human family. To understand why these fragments became so disruptive, the story must descend into the excavated hollow itself, to the industrial quarry where an ordinary operation cut unexpectedly into a vanished world. The machinery does not arrive in search of human origins. In 2010, limestone quarrying near the Israeli city of Ramla cuts into a deep depression in the bedrock, revealing sediments sealed since the Middle Pleistocene. What begins as an industrial operation becomes a rescue excavation before the exposed deposits can be lost. The place is open to the sky, not a cave. Its ancient occupants used a low basin in the limestone landscape, leaving hearth residues, animal bones, and an immense quantity of worked stone. Archaeologists must recover its sequence while the quarry continues around them. The excavation is directed by Yossi Zeidner of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Across a few dozen square meters, the team descends through a rich succession of deposits. Thousands of flint artifacts emerge beside animal remains and traces of fire. The density does not mean that one community lived here continuously. Sediment accumulated over time, and the hollow was used repeatedly. Occupations may have been separated by seasons, years, or longer intervals. What survives suggests recurring visits to a useful location, not a village frozen on a single prehistoric day. Each fragment belongs to a sequence that must be mapped before interpretation begins. Deep in that sequence lies Unit 6, the layer that produces the human remains. Their discovery seems modest. NR1 consists of part of the right side of a cranial vault, pieces of the parietal bone, joined with much of the squamous portion of the temporal bone. NR2 is a nearly complete lower jaw that preserves a molar root but no full set of teeth. These are not two skeletons, nor two complete skulls looking back from the sediment, because they were found close together and appear anatomically compatible. They may represent one individual, although that cannot be demonstrated beyond doubt. The cautious wording is essential. A site capable of generating large archaeological headlines ultimately rests its biological argument on two incomplete specimens that may be parts of a single person. Their position gives them meaning because an isolated bone has far less to say than one insecure context. The fragments are not presented as a deliberate burial. No grave structure, ceremonial arrangement, or complete body establishes funerary behavior, nor does their presence prove that different human groups sat beside the same fire. The precise events that brought them there are unknown. Natural processes, carnivores, erosion, or human activity could have dispersed the remains. The evidence remains incomplete, and association in a layer cannot become a witnessed scene. Dating Unit 6 requires several methods, Researchers analysed sediments and burned flints with techniques estimating how long grains or artefacts have been removed from sunlight or last heated. Uranium series and electron spin resonance approaches also help establish the chronology. Together, the results place the occupation broadly between about 140,000 and 120,000 years ago. Deposits form unevenly, materials can shift, and every technique carries margins of error, yet the convergence locates the individual in a crucial period, when Homo sapiens is present in the Levant and Neanderthals are known farther north. The surrounding finds deepen the puzzle without settling identity. Flint knappers at the site used prepared core methods, especially forms of Levallois production. They selected raw material, shaped a core through an ordered series of removals, and struck flakes whose final form had been anticipated. Refitting studies, in which scattered pieces are physically reunited, can recover parts of those technical sequences. They show activity occurring at the location rather than a random collection washed in from elsewhere. Hearths and burned remains indicate controlled fire, cut marks, impact damage, and broken animal bones record carcass processing and access to meat and marrow. Aurochs, equids, gazelles, tortoises, and other animals form part of the recovered assemblage, though their presence varies through the stratigraphic sequence. Not every remarkable object reported from Nesher Ramla belongs with the fossils. An aurochs bone bearing 6 incised lines came from the later Unit the 3, while a rounded grinding or abrading stone came from Unit V. Neither can confidently be placed in the hands of the Unit 6 individual. Stratigraphy keeps thousands of years from becoming one imaginary afternoon. After excavation, the bones enter a slower world of measurement and comparison. Researchers use conventional anatomical study alongside virtual reconstruction, allowing distorted or separated portions to be examined without pretending that missing anatomy has survived. The cranial vault is low and thick. The mandible is robust and lacks a true chin. Features of the jaw and temporal region invite comparisons with Neanderthals, while other aspects appear more archaic and resemble fossils much older than the deposit. The result is not a restored face. The forehead, brow region, much of the brain case, upper face, and nearly all dental evidence remain absent. Any portrait showing a precise nose, eyes, or expression is therefore artistic inference, not an image recovered by science. When the study is published in Science in 2021, the researchers proposed that the remains represent a previously unrecognized Levantine paleodeme, which they call Nesher Ramla Homo. Paleodeme is a deliberately restrained term a local ancient population recognized through a shared anatomical pattern, not automatically a new species. The authors argue that this population retained archaic traits, while also sharing characteristics with Neanderthals, and that related Levantine fossils might record its longer history. The proposal offers a possible framework for difficult specimens from sites such as Tabun, Zutiye, and Kesem. It also raises the possibility that human groups with very different anatomy participated in comparable Middle Paleolithic technologies. The reaction is immediate because the same anatomy can support another reading. Several specialists contend that the remains fit within the range of Neanderthals, perhaps representing a southern or relatively early form rather than an unnamed surviving lineage. Fragmentation magnifies the dispute features treated as a distinctive mosaic. By one analysis may appear compatible with known variation to another. There is no ancient DNA from Nesher Ramla to resolve the relationship, and the warm conditions of the Levant are generally unkind to genetic preservation. Protein or future microscopic evidence may someday add another line of inquiry, but for now morphology carries most of the burden. The quarry has preserved archaic anatomy beside an accomplished technological tradition, yet withheld the complete body and genetic evidence that might simplify its interpretation. Tens of thousands of artifacts surround a biological sample that could fit within 2 hands. The stones record repeated decisions, while the person remains taxonomically elusive. Around the excavation, modern industry continues to alter the limestone. Within the rescued deposits, an older landscape takes shape. Animals reach the hollow from surrounding plains, and groups returned because roots and resources made it useful. To understand why such an unusual person appeared here, the view must widen beyond Unit 6. The basin sits within the Levant, a corridor whose doors repeatedly opened and closed between 3 continents. The corridor is easy to misunderstand on a modern map. A narrow strip of land appears to connect Africa with Asia, with the Mediterranean on one side and deserts on the other, as though human travellers simply followed a permanent road north or south. But the Levant of the Middle Pleistocene is not a fixed passageway. It breathes with climate. Rainbelts shift, lakes expand and shrink. Grasslands spread into regions later claimed by aridity, and wooded zones climb or retreat along the hills. At certain times, movement through this land becomes easier for animals and humans alike. At others, dry barriers divide populations that may once have occupied neighbouring valleys. Nesher Ramla stands inside this changing system, not at a timeless crossroads, but at a crossroads whose roots repeatedly appear, disappear, and bend. To the southwest lies the Sinai Peninsula, and beyond it, northeastern Africa, where early Homo sapiens populations possess a deep evolutionary history. To the north, the Levant opens toward Anatolia and the colder territories occupied at different times by Neanderthals. Eastward, routes lead into Arabia and farther Asia, while the Mediterranean coast offers its own chain of plains, wetlands, cliffs, and river valleys. None of these directions guarantees uninterrupted travel. Water availability, temperature, vegetation, and prey density determine whether a route is welcoming, marginal, or effectively closed. Human dispersal therefore occurs in pulses rather than as a single outward march. Groups advance during favourable periods, settle in productive landscapes, withdraw when conditions deteriorate, and sometimes remain in refuges while the world changes around them. The animals moving through the region reveal how permeable it could become. Gazelles favour open country. Aurochs require rich grazing and dependable water. Equids move across broad terrain, while fallow deer and other species point toward patches of woodland or broken vegetation. Their ranges do not all respond identically to climate, but together they show a landscape composed of overlapping habitats. Humans following these animals are not merely pursuing meat. They're reading seasonal movement, remembering springs, locating flint, judging shelter, and deciding when a familiar basin has become too dry. The same ecological opening that carries African fauna northward may allow human populations to expand with them. A colder phase can then redirect movement and bring northern communities farther south. This constant rearrangement helps explain why the Levant preserves such a bewildering human record. Homo sapiens remains from sites including School and Kafze demonstrate an early presence in the region, long before the major expansion that eventually carried our species across Eurasia. Neanderthal fossils from Kibara, Amud, Tabun, and other sites show that they too occupied Levantine environments. Yet these populations cannot be assigned to a simple sequence in which one arrives only after the other has vanished. Dates overlap at regional scales, and occupation histories are interrupted by long gaps. A cave might preserve one population in one climatic interval and another much later. The resulting pattern resembles alternating occupation, repeated contact, or both, although the surviving evidence rarely captures an actual encounter. Nesher Ramla complicates this picture because its archaic individual lives during a period when Homo sapiens is also present in Southwest Asia. If the proposed Nesher Ramla paleodeme represents a distinct, long-persisting Levantine population, then the corridor contained more human diversity than a two-group story allows. If the fossils instead belong within Neanderthal variation, they reveal that southern Neanderthals could retain unexpectedly archaic features. Either interpretation changes the human geography. The Levant is no longer merely neutral ground between an African species and a European one. It becomes a region capable of sustaining its own population histories, preserving lineages, receiving migrants, and reshaping those who remain. Climate models and sediment records offer broad outlines, but they cannot follow a particular band of people across a particular season. During wetter phases, expanded freshwater sources and productive vegetation could create chains of habitable territory through areas that are now harsh. During drier phases, communities might concentrate near persistent springs, lake margins, river systems, or upland zones receiving more rainfall. These contractions matter as much as expansions. When people gather into refuges, formerly distant groups may come within reach of one another. When habitable zones spread again, descendants can disperse carrying genes, techniques, and traditions acquired during periods of proximity. Scholars still debate how often such contacts occurred, but fluctuating geography repeatedly created the opportunity. The stone itself adds another dimension. High-quality flint occurs across parts of the Levant, yet suitable outcrops are not distributed evenly. Knowing where to obtain it could structure movement through a territory. A prepared core embodies more than manual skill. It reflects learned sequences, expectations about fracture, and decisions about transporting raw material or finished blanks. When similar Levallois methods appear among anatomically different humans, the resemblance may result from shared inheritance, independent solutions, indirect diffusion, or direct cultural contact. Geography makes all four possibilities plausible. What it does not provide is a direction of teaching. The tools cannot identify whether knowledge moved north, south, repeatedly both ways, or through intermediate communities that left no recognizable bones. Nor should every migrating group be imagined as a mass population sweeping across a continent. Many movements may have involved modest communities extending their seasonal range, following prey into a neighboring drainage, or gradually shifting over generations. A few individuals moving between groups could carry technical knowledge far beyond the place where it began. Biological ancestry and cultural practice need not travel together. A community can adopt a method without being replaced, while newcomers can abandon an older method and learn a local one. That distinction is crucial at Nesher Ramla, where archaic anatomy and technology familiar from Homo sapiens contexts occur together without proving a shared campsite or genetic mixture. The corridor also functions as a filter. Populations adapted to one environmental regime may struggle when conditions change. Heat, cold, rainfall, plant foods, prey behavior, and disease environments impose different pressures. Yet humans are unusually flexible because knowledge can compensate for anatomy. Fire extends activity into cold periods. Cooperative hunting changes which animals can be exploited. Planned stone production reduces uncertainty when raw material is scarce. Social memory turns scattered water sources into a mental map. The people using Nesher Ramla therefore inhabit the crossroads not as passive objects carried by climate, but as decision-makers capable of responding to it. Their flexibility may help explain how an archaic-looking population, if that interpretation is correct, persisted beside expanding Homo sapiens. Recent evidence from Tinchamet Cave, announced in 2025, strengthens the impression of a culturally connected Middle Paleolithic world in the central Levant. Finds there have been interpreted as showing that humans with potentially different anatomical affiliations participated in broadly related technological and behavioral traditions. The details and identities remain under study, and Tinchamet does not prove the Nesher Ramla individual met Homo sapiens. It does, however, make rigid cultural boundaries harder to defend. Similar practices could extend across communities whose bones would later be assigned to different human categories. This is the deeper meaning of the crossroads. It does not merely channel bodies between continents. It rearranges relationships. A wet interval brings ranges together. A dry interval separates them. A stone-working concept survives after the people who introduced it have moved away. An anatomical trait persists within a population whose daily behavior resembles that of its neighbors. Generations pass, and distinctions visible to future anatomists may have mattered little to those living with them. Back in the limestone basin, the fragmentary skull and jaw become traces of this larger motion. They may belong to a lineage rooted in the Levant, to a southern Neanderthal population, or to a population history for which current labels remain inadequate. The landscape explains how such ambiguity became possible, but not what the individual looked like within it. For that, attention must return to the bones themselves, to the low cranial vault, the powerful jaw, the missing chin, and the unsettling mosaic from which scientists have tried to reconstruct a human identity. The bones offer no face, yet they invite one. A fragment of cranial vault and an almost complete lower jaw seem to promise that careful measurement might restore the person who once crossed the basin. But anatomy does not work like assembling a portrait from recognizable pieces. NR1 preserves part of the right parietal and temporal region, far behind the eyes. NR2 preserves the mandible, but nearly all its teeth are gone. Between them lies an expanse of missing bone forehead, brow ridges, cheekbones, nose, upper jaw, and most of the brain case. Scientists can compare what survives with other fossils, but every comparison begins beside an absence. Nesher Ramla's human mystery is therefore not the strange appearance of a known face. It is the biological signal contained in regions that ordinarily receive little attention outside an anatomy laboratory. NR1 immediately appears unlike the high, rounded cranial vault associated with recent Homo sapiens. Its preserved shape is low, and the bone is notably thick. The parietal surface curves differently from the more globular form of a modern human skull, contributing to an impression of an elongated archaic brain case. Along the temporal bone, the architecture surrounding the ear region and the attachment areas for chewing muscles supplies further points of comparison. Some features resemble conditions observed in Neanderthals, while others appear closer to fossils assigned to earlier Middle Pleistocene humans. None alone provides a taxonomic signature. Fossil identification depends on patterns formed by several traits, their degree of expression, and their relationship to the age and geography of comparative specimens. The jaw makes the mosaic more visible. It is robust, with a thick body capable of supporting substantial chewing forces. At the front, it lacks the projecting bony chin characteristic of Homo sapiens. A true chin is not simply the soft outline visible on a living face. It is a structural configuration of the mandibular symphysis, where the two halves of the jaw meet during early development. In NR2, that region recedes rather than projecting in the modern pattern. This is an archaic condition, but hardly an identification card. Neanderthals also lack a modern chin, as do numerous earlier members of the genus Homo. The absence excludes an anatomically typical modern human jaw more readily than it distinguishes among several archaic possibilities. Other portions of NR2 draw the comparison toward Neanderthals: the shape of the mandibular notch, the position and form of structures on the inner surface, and aspects of the ramus, the rising part connecting the tooth-bearing body to the jaw joint, were described as sharing derived features with Neanderthal specimens. At the same time, the jaw retains characteristics interpreted as more primitive than those commonly found in later Neanderthals. This mixture underpins the proposal that Nesher Ramla preserves a population related to Neanderthals, but rooted in an older Levantine ancestry. Critics reply that early or geographically southern Neanderthals need not resemble the classic fossils from late Pleistocene Europe in every detail. The same structure can therefore be read as a mosaic belonging to a separate paleodeme, or as variation within a wider Neanderthal lineage. Age and biological sex could affect some features, but neither can be established securely. Dental wear often helps estimate adulthood. Yet the almost complete loss of crowns restricts that approach. The surviving molar root and the mature development of the bones indicate an adult, while more precise aging remains uncertain. Sex estimation from a fragmentary skull and isolated mandible is even less reliable, especially when the comparative population is unknown. Robustness may look masculine through a modern lens, but population differences can be larger than assumed sex differences. Calling the individual male or female would give the narration a comforting specificity that the evidence does not possess. Even the possibility that NR1 and NR2 came from one person remains an inference. They were recovered close together in the same stratigraphic context, and no anatomical contradiction prevents them from belonging together. Yet they do not physically join, and no genetic test has linked them. If they represent two individuals, the sample contains slightly more biological variation, but even less of either body. If they belong to one, the proposed population is represented at Nesher Ramla by a single incomplete adult. Both possibilities demand restraint. A reconstructed population assembled from one jaw and one cranial fragment can easily appear more uniform on paper than any living community ever was. Virtual methods allow researchers to orient the remains, mirror preserved structures where appropriate, and compare three-dimensional landmarks across fossil samples. These techniques reduce some problems caused by breakage and enable analyses impossible with calipers alone. They do not manufacture missing anatomy. A digital model may show the preserved curvature with remarkable precision, while leaving the forehead and face as blank space. Statistical placement also depends upon which fossils enter the comparison and which measurements survive across them. A specimen may fall near Neanderthals in one analysis, and nearer archaic Middle Pleistocene humans in another, because different anatomical regions preserve different histories. The evidence remains incomplete, and mathematical clarity should not be mistaken for biological finality. That limitation is particularly important because human evolution does not produce perfectly bundled sets of traits. Features change at different rates and may be inherited through populations with complicated ancestry. Natural selection can shape some regions, while genetic drift alters others. Gene flow can introduce traits without replacing an entire population. A jaw may retain an ancestral form after other parts of the skull become more Neanderthal-like. or the apparent combination may fall within variation that remains poorly sampled. The fossil record exaggerates discontinuity because thousands of generations are represented by a handful of individuals. What appears to be a sharp anatomical boundary may once have been a broad field of overlapping forms. No ancient DNA has been recovered to test those relationships directly. Warm conditions, fluctuating moisture, and time damage the molecular material stored in bone. The absence is scientifically consequential because genomes transformed the interpretation of Neanderthals and Denisovans, revealing interbreeding that anatomy alone could not securely establish. At Nesher Ramla, researchers cannot calculate genetic affinity, identify inherited segments, or determine whether this individual carried ancestry from Homo sapiens. Proteins sometimes survive where DNA does not, and future techniques may extract information now inaccessible, but no such result presently supplies the missing family tree. The bones must speak through form, and form has several plausible dialects. A face reconstruction would add even more uncertainty. The preserved areas cannot determine the width of the nose, projection of the midface, form of the brow, colour of the skin, pattern of hair, or expression. Artists may build a biologically possible head by borrowing from Neanderthals or other archaic humans, yet the finished image inevitably contains assumptions. It can make a scientific hypothesis feel like recognition. This is what the lost population looked like. In reality, the individual may have differed substantially from that portrait. The most accurate image remains partial, a powerful jaw beneath a face that cannot be recovered, and a low cranial fragment behind features that sediment did not preserve. Still, the fragments are not mute. Together they exclude an ordinary Homo sapiens morphology and reveal an adult whose anatomy combines deeply retained characteristics with features linking the specimen to the Neanderthal story. That combination is the source of its importance, not any claim that the bones are bizarre or primitive. This person belonged to a population adapted to its own time, capable of the planned stonecraft found across Unit 6. The body preserves ancestry, the tools preserve learned behavior. Neither follows a simple ladder of advancement. Once those anatomical signals are measured, however, another difficulty begins. Scientists must decide what kind of human variation deserves a separate name. How far Neanderthal identity can stretch across geography and time, and whether a proposed paleodeme clarifies the record or merely labels its uncertainty. The faceless individual has been described as a survivor of an unknown Levantine population, and as a southern member of a population already known. The bones themselves do not choose between those categories. That argument belongs not inside the vanished person's appearance, but inside the changing human system used to classify the dead. The argument begins where the bones end. NR1 and NR2 preserve enough anatomy to resist an easy identification, but not enough to compel a single alternative. The researchers who introduced Nesher Ramla Homo in 2021 were not simply searching for a dramatic new name. They were confronting a recurring problem in paleoanthropology: how to describe human populations that combine traits seen in several groups, occupy poorly sampled regions, and survive only as fragments. Classification promises order, yet the ancient world did not organize its inhabitants according to the categories later scientists would create. Populations varied across geography, exchanged genes, and changed gradually, leaving distinctions that need not mark separate species. That is why the term paleodeme matters. A deme is a local breeding population. A paleodeme is an inferred ancient counterpart recognized in the fossil record. The label allows researchers to discuss a regional anatomical pattern without formally declaring a new species. In the original interpretation, the Nesher Ramla remains belonged to a previously unrecognized Levantine population that retained archaic features late into the Middle Pleistocene, while also sharing traits with Neanderthals. The proposal is less absolute than headlines about a new human species suggest. It identifies a working population hypothesis, one intended to connect scattered evidence and to be tested against future fossils. The hypothesis gains breadth by looking beyond the quarry. Its advocates compare NR1 and NR2 with contested fossils from other Levantine sites, including an older jaw and isolated teeth from Gesem Cave, the Sutia skull fragment, and material from Tabun Cave. These specimens span large stretches of time and are not anatomically identical. Yet some have long appeared difficult to place neatly among Homo sapiens, classic Neanderthals, or earlier Middle Pleistocene humans. Grouping them within a persistent regional paleodeme offers a possible history rather than a collection of exceptions. Under this model, an archaic Levantine population endured into the age of Nesher Ramla while interacting with neighbouring lineages. But this explanatory reach is also its weakness. The more fossils a proposed paleodeme gathers, the more differences it must absorb. Specimens separated by geography and immense time cannot be joined merely because each seems unusual. Similar traits may be ancestral features retained independently, and fragmentary remains can appear alike because the diagnostic regions are missing. There is no DNA linking Nesher Ramla to Kesem, Zutie, or Tabun, nor is there a continuous series of fossils showing one local population changing through every intervening period. What survives in the record suggests connections worth testing, not an established genealogy. Several researchers therefore argue that Nesher Ramla fits more economically within Neanderthal diversity. In this view, the low cranial vault, robust chinless mandible, and derived details of the jaw and temporal bone are not evidence for a separate Levantine population. They are features of an early, southern, or otherwise variable Neanderthal. The familiar image of Neanderthals is shaped disproportionately by later European fossils. Many adapted to different climates and separated from Nesher Ramla by tens of thousands of years. Expecting every member of that broader lineage to display the full classic package risks turning a regional endpoint into the definition of the entire population. This alternative does not make the specimen ordinary. A southern Neanderthal from roughly 140,000 to 120,000 years ago would still expand understanding of where Neanderthals lived and how their anatomy varied. It would also preserve the central behavioural surprise a human with Neanderthal affinities used a sophisticated Levallois tradition, closely comparable to methods known among regional Homo sapiens. The disagreement concerns biological interpretation, not whether the finds are important. One side sees a persistent archaic paleodeme with Neanderthal connections. The other sees Neanderthal variation expressed in an early southern form. Both recognize that simple equations between anatomy, territory, and culture no longer work. The debate published around the science reports exposes how classification depends upon scale. Viewed closely, each fossil individual is unique. Viewed across a single region, recurring features may define a population. Viewed across Western Eurasia, those same features may become local variation within a larger Neanderthal lineage. Move the boundary far enough outward, and even Neanderthals and Homo sapiens appear not as completely isolated species, but as closely related populations that interbred. Yet collapsing every difference into one variable humanity would erase meaningful evolutionary histories. Taxonomy must distinguish without pretending that nature always supplied clean divisions. Species names are especially difficult in human evolution because the standard biological definition centers on reproductive isolation. Fossils do not preserve mating boundaries, and ancient genomes have shown that groups given different names sometimes had fertile descendants. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens exchanged genes, but they also maintained recognizable anatomical and genetic histories over long periods. Interbreeding, therefore, does not automatically make every group one species, just as anatomical difference does not prove complete isolation. Nesher Ramla lacks genetic evidence entirely, so its status must be inferred from morphology, chronology, and geography. No single explanation fully accounts for all three. There is also a danger in treating a name as a discovery rather than a tool. Once a fossil receives this memorable label, maps acquire a new colored territory, illustrations give the population a face, and narratives describe its rise and disappearance. Repetition can make the hypothesis feel settled. Nesher Ramla Homo then begins to sound like a formally established species with known appearance, culture, and ancestry. Although none of those claims follows from the term, the responsible use of the label keeps its uncertainty visible. It refers to the paleodeme proposed by the research team, not to a universally accepted branch of the genus Homo. Future discoveries could shift the balance. More complete fossils from securely dated Levantine deposits might reveal whether the Nesher Ramla combination recurs. Ancient proteins could offer biological affinities where DNA has failed, while improved dating might clarify whether supposedly related specimens overlap or form a chronological sequence. Additional study of internal bone structures and dental remains may supply traits less affected by external shape. Any result could complicate matters further. A specimen might prove genetically close to Neanderthals while carrying ancestry from a deeply separated Levantine population, making both present interpretations partly correct. For now, the name remains a signpost beside an unresolved boundary. The person from Unit 6 was not uncertain about being human. Uncertainty belongs to the observers attempting to locate that life within a family tree. Whether the individual represented a distinct paleodeme or a southern Neanderthal, the classification cannot recover the social world in which identity actually mattered. Those categories were lived through kinship, familiarity, movement, and learned practice, not through cranial measurements. The next clues therefore lie outside taxonomy, in the basin where this population found water, watched animals cross changing ground, returned to fires, and made a temporary place within an ancient lakeside landscape. The basin does not need a permanent lake to draw life toward it. Nesher Ramla occupies a funnel-shaped depression, open to wind, rain, and sun. Its hollow formed as the ground sagged and collapsed above cavities in the limestone. At the top, the ancient depression measured roughly 40 meters across. Lower in the sequence, it narrowed toward 11. Soil washed down its sides. Wet conditions sometimes held water in the sediment. Plants colonized exposed surfaces, and human visitors added ash, bone, and stone. This is not a cave with a protective ceiling, a village beside a stable shoreline, or a camp preserved from one season. It is a natural hollow repeatedly made useful by people moving through an open landscape. From the rim, those visitors would have seen terrain changing with season and climate. The Mediterranean coast lay to the west, while the Judean highlands rose farther east. Between them stretched a patchwork rather than one uniform plain open grass, scrub, stands of trees, shallow drainage routes, and dependable or temporary water sources. During wetter intervals, vegetation spread and soils retained moisture. In drier months, exposed ground hardened, green patches contracted, and animals concentrated around whatever water remained. The exact appearance of Unit 6 cannot be reconstructed like a photograph. The depression itself may have been attractive because it broke the profile of the plain. Its sloping sides offered some relief from wind and a place where activity could be organized, even without providing the security of a cave. Smoke might settle differently below the rim, and accumulated soil created surfaces on which fires could be established. Yet low ground also carried disadvantages. Runoff brought mud. Waterlogging could make parts of the basin unpleasant or unusable. Exposure remained a constant fact. Summer sun, winter rain, and changing winds reached anyone inside. People did not discover a naturally perfect home. They evaluated a place whose usefulness shifted, returned when conditions favored it, and left when the balance changed. Across the archaeological sequence, animal remains preserve a broad economy built around both large and small game. Aurochs, equids, gazelles, fallow deer, tortoises, and other animals belong to the wider ecological and archaeological world of the site. These species did not necessarily arrive together, nor does every bone belong to the fossil-bearing Unit 6. That distinction prevents the entire sequence from becoming a single imaginary menu. What the lower deposits do support is capable hunting, carcass processing, and the consumption of animal foods. Cut marks and broken bones testify to practiced actions separating joints, removing flesh, opening elements rich in marrow, and reducing a heavy carcass into portions that people could carry and share. Hunting large animals requires more than a sharp flake. Aurochs were powerful wild cattle, far larger and less manageable than their later domestic descendants. Equids could cross open ground quickly, and gazelles were alert to movement. Successful pursuit demanded knowledge of paths, wind, cover, and the behavior of prey. It may also have required cooperation, although the number and organization of hunters cannot be recovered. The tools do not identify whether animals were ambushed near the basin or killed farther away, nor can every fracture reveal who performed a task. What survives in the records suggests planning and repeated competence, while the social choreography behind it remains invisible. Fire made the hollow more than a place to cut meat. Researchers have identified combustion features and burned materials, showing that occupants maintained hearths rather than merely taking advantage of natural burning. Wood served as fuel, and animal foods were cooked or roasted. Fire extended usable hours, softened food, provided warmth during cold periods, discouraged some predators, and created a focus around which work could continue. Maintaining it required attention, collecting suitable wood, protecting embers, clearing ash, and judging how flames behaved in an exposed depression. A hearth is often imagined as the emotional center of a camp, but archaeology cannot recover the feelings around it. It can show repeated technical control, fuel decisions, and heat-altering material in place. Daily life therefore appears as a rhythm of tasks rather than a permanent settlement. Flint arrives as nodules, cores, flakes, or finished edges. Wood must be gathered. Carcass portions are transported, processed, cooked, and consumed. Edges are resharpened when they become dull. Waste gathers near places of work, while useful pieces may be carried away. A visit could last hours, days, or longer, but the surviving evidence does not supply a calendar. The density of finds across the sequence reflects recurrent use over immense time, not a single crowded community. No house foundations define family spaces, and no storage structures prove planned residence. The basin was familiar enough to revisit, yet familiarity is not the same as permanence. Nor can the fragmentary person be assigned a specific job within that routine. The robust jaw does not reveal a hunter, toolmaker, firekeeper, or social leader. Whereon missing teeth cannot reconstruct a habitual activity. Even if NR1 and NR2 belong to one adult, no personal possessions link that individual to a particular core or animal bone. The temptation to place the faceless figure beside one hearth is understandable, but stratigraphic association works at a coarser scale than biography. This person belonged to the archaeological world represented in Unit 6. The precise day, activity, and circumstances of deposition are beyond recovery. Still, the site reveals a population fully attentive to practical detail. Fire had to be sustained, stone fracture anticipated, and animal anatomy understood. Seasonal scarcity would reward memory where water persisted, when herds passed, which slopes provided fuel, and where good flint could be found. Such knowledge lived in repeated instruction and observation. It was cultural before anyone attempted to classify the bones. An archaic cranial form says nothing about an archaic mind, and the organized remains at Nesher Ramla resist any ladder in which biological resemblance to modern humans determines behavioral ability. When the group departed, the depression continued its patient work. Wind carried dust across abandoned surfaces. Rain drew soil down the slopes. Vegetation returned. Burned patches faded, and another occupation laid fresh flakes above older ones. Eventually the jaw and cranial fragment entered this accumulating record, while the individual's name, relationships, and final movements disappeared. What remained was not a complete camp but a layered record of choices. Among those choices, none is more revealing than the transformation of flint. The inhabitants did not simply strike stones until an edge appeared. They followed ordered sequences, prepared convex surfaces, managed angles, and anticipated a flake before the decisive blow. Those methods resemble technical traditions used by other humans across the Levant. From the exposed hollow, the mystery therefore shifts into the stone itself, where shared procedures raise a difficult possibility. Knowledge may have crossed biological boundaries that modern classification tries to keep apart. The decisive blow lasts only an instant. A hammerstone strikes the edge of a flint core, force travels through the stone, and a flake separates along a path created before impact. The napper has managed the surfaces, preserved useful convexities, and arranged a platform so that one removal will produce an edge suited to a future task. At Nesher Ramla, this sequence survives in discarded cores, flakes, chips, and broken pieces. Together they reveal a technology based not simply on force, but on anticipation. The artisans were shaping an outcome hidden inside the stone. Archaeologists call this family of methods Levallois technology. The term describes neither the one standardized tool nor a single recipe. It refers to prepared core strategies in which a napper organizes the volume of a stone before detaching a desired flake, point, or series. One surface becomes the flaking surface, another helps form the platform, and earlier removals guide later ones. Some cores produce one preferential flake after extensive preparation. Others yield a recurrent series. What unites them is the management of shape through an ordered sequence. That order is easy to underestimate when objects lie silent in a museum tray. Flint fractures predictably only within limits. A poor angle can crush the platform, a hidden flaw can redirect the break. Removing too much from one side can flatten the convexity needed for the next flake. The napper must read the material while holding a future form in mind and adjusting after every strike. This requires learned perception, practiced movement, and an ability to organize several steps toward a deferred result. A Levallois flake is both a cutting edge and the conclusion of a plan. At Nesher Ramla, refitting makes parts of that plan visible. Archaeologists can sometimes reunite flakes with the core from which they were struck or join broken fragments. Each fit reverses one moment of fracture. Several fits can reconstruct the order in which surfaces were prepared, blanks removed, and mistakes corrected. They also show that at least some napping occurred inside the depression. The artifacts were not merely tools carried in by water. People worked flint there, selected useful products, and left pieces behind. Raw material could arrive as an unworked nodule, a partly prepared core or completed flakes ready for use. After cutting hide, flesh, tendon, or wood, an edge might be retouched, discarded, or carried away. The record preserves these stages unevenly. A core abandoned after failure may reveal a detailed sequence, while a successful tool disappears with its user. Waste is therefore not meaningless debris. It often preserves technical decisions that a finished object conceals. The Nesher Ramla assemblage matters because its prepared core practices resemble Levallois methods associated with contemporary Homo sapiens in the Levant. The original researchers emphasize similarities in core preparation and flake production, arguing that comparable traditions crossed anatomical divisions. The Unit 6 fossils possess archaic and Neanderthal-related features, yet the surrounding stonework follows procedures familiar from sites occupied by humans with more modern anatomy. The association separates biological appearance from technical competence. No form of skull owns a method, but similarity is not a record of a lesson. A core cannot identify the napper's ancestry, and comparable sequences do not reveal who learned from whom. The resemblance could reflect direct transmission between populations that met, indirect transmission through neighboring communities, inheritance from an older tradition, or independent development under similar constraints. Flint breaks according to the same physical properties for everyone. Skilled groups seeking portable, sharp, predictable flakes may converge upon related solutions without face-to-face contact. Distinguishing these possibilities requires more than noticing that artifacts look alike. Researchers compare the chain of operations: raw material selection, platform preparation, management of convexities, targeted products, core rotation, and abandonment. Rare, arbitrary habits may carry a stronger cultural signal than obvious functional solutions. Even then, traditions vary within communities, and nappers make mistakes or improvise. Assemblages also accumulate across repeated visits. A pattern that seems uniform within an excavated unit may combine many individuals and generations. The technology therefore cannot prove that Nesher Ramla people and Homo sapiens shared one camp. It does not demonstrate conversation, trade, intermarriage, alliance, or conflict. Nor does it establish a one-way story in which modern humans brought innovation to a more archaic population. That assumption would insert an evolutionary ladder into evidence that undermines it. If knowledge passed directly, the direction could have been northward, southward, reciprocal, or repeatedly altered. The archaic-looking inhabitants might have taught techniques as readily as they learned them. The stones preserve compatibility between minds, not the hierarchy of an encounter. Still, complex technological resemblance makes a completely isolated world less likely. Prepared core skills are maintained through observation, practice, correction, and repetition. A learner must discover where to strike and how to see the core as an experienced napper sees it. Such knowledge survives across generations only when communities transmit it. Young people would have learned within those communities, although no juvenile remains from units permit a scene. Adults could also adopt unfamiliar procedures after migration or contact. Culture is flexible in precisely the way anatomy is not a method, can cross a boundary within one lifetime. This flexibility helps explain why regional stone industries do not map neatly onto fossil categories. Researchers once hoped that a recognizable toolkit might serve almost as a population label. Yet broad Middle Paleolithic technologies appear among humans with different anatomies, while related populations can use different methods. Tools move through teaching, genes through reproduction, bodies through migration. These processes may coincide, but they do not have to. At Nesher Ramla, their partial independence is the central lesson. The artifacts also resist the word primitive. People economized raw material, adjusted reduction strategies, and produced edges suited to varied work. Their decisions belong to hunting, carcass processing, fire use, and movement through the landscape. Planning helped transform uncertainty into manageable tasks. A prepared core carried potential future cutting edges contained within one transportable mass. Knowledge reduced risk before hunger or distance made an edge urgently necessary. When the last flake fell, no one marked whether the method belonged to one population or many. The napper recognized a successful fracture, perhaps passed the product to another person, and continued the work of the day. Only after anatomy and stone were buried together did their association become a scientific puzzle. The resemblance now points toward a shared cultural world, but stops short of proving the encounters that created it. To search for those encounters, the story must move beyond technique alone. Other Levantine sites preserve Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, burials, pigments, animal remains, and related ways of working stone. Their dates and deposits do not combine into one witnessed meeting. Yet together they test whether anatomically different humans occupied overlapping landscapes and participated in traditions whose boundaries were more permeable than their bones suggest. The Levantine sites do not arrange themselves into a photograph of contact. They lie across uncertain distances and times. At one, Homo sapiens bones appear with Middle Paleolithic tools. At another, Neanderthal remains occur beside broadly similar technology. Nesher Ramla adds archaic anatomy between them. Together, these places suggest that several human populations inhabited the same regional world. Yet a region can be shared without two groups ever standing face to face. The first task is chronological, to ask who was present, where, and how closely their occupations approached one another. At School Cave on Mount Carmel and Kafsa Cave near Nazareth, fossils assigned to early Homo sapiens show that people with substantially modern anatomy occupied the Levant long before the later Upper Paleolithic expansion. Their ages are often summarized broadly as about 120,000 to 90,000 years ago, although individual specimens and layers carry debated estimates. These people buried some of their dead, used prepared core methods, and hunted within Mediterranean landscapes. Nesher Ramla, dated approximately 140,000 to 120,000 years ago, approaches the early end of that record. Dating margins make it possible that the quarry's archaic inhabitants and Homo sapiens elsewhere in the Levant existed during overlapping generations. This makes contact possible, not demonstrated. School, Kafze, and Nesher Ramla do not share one stratigraphic surface. No artifact carries a maker's anatomy between them, and no skeleton records a parent from another group. Chronological overlap is an opening through which an encounter could occur. It is not the encounter itself. Classic Levantine Neanderthal remains from Kibara, Amud, and other contexts are generally later, especially within roughly 80,000 to 55,000 years ago. These finds prevent Neanderthals from being confined to cold European caves. They moved through open terrain, used Levallois technology, and occupied ecological mosaics also familiar to Homo sapiens. Their later dates, however, cannot be projected backward to prove that they met the Nesher Ramla individual. Taboon Cave demonstrates why simple sequences become disputed. Fossils and layers accumulated there across a vast period, and the age and context of particular human remains remain debated. A Neanderthal-like skeleton may seem to provide a fixed point, but its relationship to neighbouring deposits must be reconstructed through old excavation records. The same cave can be used by different populations thousands of years apart without proving that they shared it. A new perspective arrived from Tinchemet Cave in 2025. Deposits dating to around 100,000 years ago yielded articulated human remains with stone tools, animal bones, abundant ochre, and evidence interpreted as intentional burial. Researchers placed the site within a broader interval of approximately 130,000 to 80,000 years ago, when different human morphologies occurred across the southern Levant. They argued that comparable behaviours point toward increasing interaction among populations. Tinchemet preserves no conversation, but it strengthens the image of a region in which cultural practices became widely shared. The ochre is evocative because some material appears to have come from sources many tens of kilometres away. Its acquisition required movement, exchange, or knowledge of distant terrain. Association with burials suggests socially elaborated behaviour rather than accidental coloured sediment. Yet ochre does not reveal the biological identity of every person who handled it, and similar use does not prove one community copied another. We can establish that mineral colour was selected, transported, and placed. Its meanings remain beyond recovery. Burial evidence demands the same discipline. Articulated remains and context can support intentional placement of a body, but they do not make all Middle Paleolithic burials identical rituals. Nor does shared burial practice establish a shared language or cosmology. It shows that anatomically diverse people in the region sometimes organize death through deliberate actions. That resemblance narrows the imaginative distance between populations without erasing their distinct histories. Stone technology supplies the most continuous comparison. At Nesher Ramla, Skul, Kafze, Tinchemet, and Neanderthal-associated sites. Prepared core methods appear within assemblages shaped by local materials and changing traditions. Differences remain, but no clean technological border separates every Homo sapiens occupation from every archaic or Neanderthal one. The tools form a regional grammar with many accents. This is compatible with teaching across group boundaries, but also with inherited traditions and independent choices. Cultural uniformity is a hypothesis about connection, not a label attached automatically to every flake. The possibility of biological mixture remains compelling and difficult to locate at a specific site. Genomes from later humans and Neanderthals prove that the two lineages interbred, while older gene flow signals suggest earlier contacts. But there is no ancient DNA from Nesher Ramla, Skul, Kafze, or Tinchemet that directly joins their individuals into one pedigree. genetic evidence from distant populations can establish that contact happened somewhere within broader histories. It cannot turn Levantine archaeological overlap into a documented family. Several scenarios remain open. Communities may have met repeatedly and exchanged partners as well as skills. Ideas may have travelled through chains of neighbouring groups whose members rarely moved far. Populations may have alternated through the same valleys as climate opened and closed routes, leaving similar adaptations without direct coexistence. Some may have carried ancestry or traditions acquired in earlier contacts. These scenarios are not mutually exclusive. Across tens of thousands of years, the Levant could have witnessed all of them. Any encounter would not necessarily have been recognized through today's categories. People might have noticed differences in face, body, voice, ornament, or custom, but familiarity can be created through repeated contact. A stranger could become a partner, rival, spouse, captive, teacher, or kin. Conversely, groups whose skeletons appear similar might have treated one another as enemies. Biology does not dictate social boundaries. The labels Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, and Nesher Ramla. Homo describe analytical relationships. They do not recover the names by which communities understood themselves. The regional evidence is therefore powerful and frustrating. It replaces isolated species moving through separate worlds with a landscape of plausible interaction. It shows behavioral similarities too extensive to dismiss, and human morphologies too variable for a simple succession. Yet it withholds the decisive scene. No shared hearth contains two diagnostic skeletons. No tool passes visibly from one anatomical group to another. No genome from Unit 6 confirms mixed ancestry. Contact has not been proved, but isolation can no longer be assumed. The mystery then reaches deeper than whether two bands once met. If Nesher Ramla represents a long-lived Levantine paleodeme, that population may have contributed biologically or culturally to the emergence of Neanderthal traits beyond the region. If it represents an early southern Neanderthal, the fossils still challenge an origin story centered only on Europe. In both readings, the Levant becomes more than a bridge crossed by finished human types. It may have been one of the landscapes in which those types were formed, mixed, and repeatedly redefined. To follow that possibility, the story must turn northward and backward, toward the debated roots of the Neanderthals themselves. Neanderthals did not begin as the finished figures preserved in Ice Age caves. Their familiar anatomy emerged across hundreds of thousands of years from populations whose movements remain incompletely known. Classic Neanderthals possessed long, low skulls, projecting mid-faces, large nasal regions, robust bodies, and characteristic teeth and skeletons. Earlier fossils show only portions of that pattern. The question is not where the first Neanderthals stood, but how scattered populations gradually became a recognizable lineage. Genetic evidence places the separation of Homo sapiens ancestors from the population ancestral to Neanderthals and Denisovans hundreds of thousands of years before Nesher Ramla, broadly around 550,000 to 765,000 years ago. Neanderthal and Denisovan branches then divided, although estimates vary. These were not single moments in one valley. Divergence describes populations becoming distinct while some gene flow may have continued. Geography could separate them, reconnect them, and divide their descendants again. Fossils from Cima de los Huesos in Spain, about 430,000 years old, already display Neanderthal-derived traits, particularly in the face and teeth. Nuclear DNA links them to Neanderthals, while their mitochondrial history suggests a more complicated relationship within the Neanderthal-Denisovan world. SEMA shows a Neanderthal lineage developing in Western Eurasia long before Nesher Ramla. It does not establish that every trait originated in Europe, or that later Neanderthals descended from one isolated population. Here the original Nesher Ramla proposal becomes ambitious. Its authors suggested that related archaic people occupied the Levant for hundreds of thousands of years and contributed to Neanderthal evolution through dispersals into Europe. Under that model, fossils from Kisim, Zutiye, and Tabun preserve a regional population history. Neanderthal-like traits need not arise entirely in Europe. The Levant could send populations northward during favourable intervals while also receiving newcomers. The proposal addresses a genuine puzzle. Some Levantine fossils combine archaic characteristics with Neanderthal-like traits, but resist a linear sequence. A long-lived paleodeme could unite those fragments and explain why the Nesher Ramla jaw looks both ancient and related to later forms. It could also provide a population through which exchanges occurred between incoming Homo sapiens and Neanderthal ancestors. The Crossroads would help create lineages rather than merely receive them after formation elsewhere. But the model reaches farther back than the secure Nesher Ramla association. Unit 6 dates to roughly 140,000 to 120,000 years ago. Claiming related people influenced Neanderthals much earlier depends on fossils from other sites, each with preservation, dating, and taxonomic problems. Similar anatomy may reflect shared ancestry or primitive features common to several populations. Without a continuous sequence or molecular evidence, resemblance cannot establish that one paleodeme endured throughout. Critics reverse the explanation. Instead of making Nesher Ramla a source, they place the fossils within a widespread Neanderthal lineage. Populations expanding south could have reached the Levant, where isolation, ancestry, and local conditions produced a distinctive form. Archaic traits might reflect retained morphology, or variation poorly represented by surviving fossils. The Levant remains important, but as the southern edge of Neanderthal diversity rather than its birthplace. Neither geography is as simple as its arrows. Europe was not one population, nor Southwest Asia a sealed refuge. Glacial cycles changed which territories were habitable. Northern populations contracted during severe cold. Warmer, wetter phases opened routes through Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. Groups could expand from the Levant into Europe, while Eurasian descendants moved south during another interval. Ancestry could circulate both ways. Asking whether Neanderthals came from Europe or the Levant may impose one origin upon a network. The Denisovan connection enlarges that network. Denisovans are known genetically from remains far apart in Asia, yet their anatomical range is uncertain. Common ancestry with Neanderthals implies an earlier Eurasian population before the branches became distinct. Genetics also detects contributions from deeply divergent groups not securely matched to fossils. These ghost populations reveal communities whose bones are missing or unrecognized. Nesher Ramla could represent such a history, but resemblance to a ghost signal is not evidence of identity. Gene flow further weakens clean branching. Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens, and genomic models indicate earlier exchanges among archaic populations. A population can contribute ancestry without replacing another or leaving a durable anatomical package. A visible trait can persist after much of the genome changes. If Levantine people moved north, their contribution might survive unevenly. If Neanderthals moved south and mixed locally, the Nesher Ramla mosaic might record the reverse. Neither scenario is testable from NR1 and NR2 alone. This uncertainty also changes the meaning of survival. Headlines sometimes describe Nesher Ramla Homo as a relic population that lasted until about 120,000 years ago, as though an ancient species had hidden unchanged beside newer humans. Yet persistence does not mean stasis. A regional population surviving for many millennia would experience births, migrations, selection, drift, and contact. Its anatomy could retain old features while its ancestry changed. The word relic is useful only if it does not turn living evolutionary history into a museum specimen. Biological ancestry also cannot explain culture in one direction. Even if Levantine populations contributed to Neanderthal formation, that would not prove they invented Levallois technology or transmitted every shared practice. Technical traditions can spread without major migration, and migrants can learn from residents. The proposed source population and the evidence for cultural contact remain related hypotheses, not one fact. Their overlap makes Nesher Ramla compelling, but it also makes the site vulnerable to narratives that outrun what its deposits support. The strongest conclusion is therefore geographical rather than genealogical. The Levant repeatedly connected populations developing across Africa and Eurasia. It could preserve older forms, receive newcomers, and send descendants outward. Such a region is exactly where mixed anatomy should appear, and exactly where a simple tree should fail. Nesher Ramla confirms that an archaic human population occupied this corridor late in the Middle Pleistocene. Whether that population helped generate Neanderthals, belonged to them, or carried ancestry from several sources remains unresolved. The answer may never come from the shape of these bones alone. It would require a more complete fossil, surviving proteins, recoverable DNA, or another site where anatomy and chronology align more clearly. Until then, the proposed origin story remains one route through a landscape of possibilities. The jaw and cranial fragment point northward, backward, and sideways at once. Their ambiguity is not an obstacle pasted onto human evolution. It may be a faithful trace of evolution as it occurred. And every evolutionary route eventually returns to a personal question. Whatever label scientists choose, the Unit 6 individual belonged to the final known chapter of this population at Nesher Ramla. The deposits reveal how people lived, but not why their anatomical pattern later disappears from view. To follow the mystery forward, attention must shift from origins to endings, whether these people vanished, merged with neighbours, moved beyond recognition, or survive only as an unidentifiable thread woven into other human lineages. Disappearance is visible only from the far side of time. Within Unit 6, the people of Nesher Ramla were present making fire, shaping flint, processing animals, and moving through a familiar landscape beyond roughly 120,000 years ago. Their distinctive anatomical pattern no longer appears in the known record. That silence can feel like an ending. Yet archaeology has not uncovered a final camp, a layer of catastrophe, or a moment when one population was replaced by another. It has uncovered the last evidence currently recognized. The difference between a last appearance and an extinction is the center of the problem. The quarry cannot tell us whether the group continued elsewhere. Open-air occupations are especially vulnerable. Erosion removes surfaces, construction destroys deposits, and acidic or fluctuating conditions dissolve bone while leaving stone tools behind. A community could inhabit a region for generations without contributing a single identifiable skull to the fossil record. When the record falls silent, the missing evidence may reflect geology as readily as demography. Even the end of occupation within the depression need not mark the end of its users. Local drainage changed as sediment accumulated. A hollow that once offered a useful place for fire and butchery could become waterlogged. filled, exposed, or simply inconvenient. The abandonment of one repeatedly visited place can result from practical decisions rather than disaster. Nesher Ramla preserves activity, not the territorial limits of a population. One possibility is demographic disappearance. Smaller, scattered groups are vulnerable even without a dramatic catastrophe. Several poor seasons can reduce births and increase deaths. A disease episode, loss of prey, or failure of regional connections can leave communities too small to recover. Climate during the late Middle Pleistocene repeatedly altered rainfall and vegetation across the Levant. Such changes did not produce one simple wave of extinction, but they could redistribute people and intensify competition. A population might diminish over centuries until no community remained large enough to maintain its distinct ancestry. No evidence identifies such a collapse at Nesher Ramla. There is no cemetery showing sudden mortality and no environmental layer that can be tied directly to the disappearance of the fossil morphology. A dry interval can make one corridor difficult while opening opportunities elsewhere. A wetter phase can attract newcomers and reconnect previously separated groups. Climate changes the probabilities of survival and movement. It does not act as a solitary executioner. A second possibility is migration. The people represented in units may have moved north, south, or east as habitats shifted. If their descendants entered regions where fossils remain unknown, they would disappear from the Levantine record without becoming extinct. They might later be classified under another name if their anatomy changed or mixed with resident populations. Movement is particularly plausible in a corridor where human presence repeatedly expanded and contracted. But a possible route is not a traced journey. No later skeleton can yet be identified as a Nesher Ramla descendant. The third possibility is absorption. When populations meet, the smaller group need not be killed or driven away to lose its visible distinctiveness. Partnerships, child-rearing, adoption, and repeated movement between communities can merge ancestries over generations. If Nesher Ramla people exchange mates with Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, or related archaic groups, their descendants might increasingly resemble the larger neighbouring population. The Paleodeme could cease to exist as a recognisable anatomical cluster, while portions of its ancestry survived. Ancient genomes make this scenario biologically credible. They demonstrate that lineages once depicted as separate branches exchange genes. But credibility is not confirmation. No DNA from NR1 or NR2 allows researchers to search later genomes for a Nesher Ramla signature. Without a reference genome, an inherited segment cannot be labelled as belonging to this population. Genetic models sometimes infer ancestry from unsampled or deeply divergent groups, often called ghost populations. But those signals cannot be assigned to Nesher Ramla merely because the fossils are mysterious. Assimilation would also blur anatomy unevenly. Traits are influenced by many genes, development, and population history. A chin, jaw form, or cranial contour does not pass intact as a badge of identity. Descendants can carry substantial ancestry without displaying the exact combination visible in an ancestor, while a familiar-looking trait can persist after most ancestry has changed. Searching later fossils for one diagnostic feature may therefore miss continuity. Finding it may falsely suggest continuity. The mosaic that makes Nesher Ramla difficult to classify would become even harder to follow through mixture. A fourth explanation is partly taxonomic. Perhaps nothing called Nesher Ramla Homo disappeared because it was never a separate population in the proposed sense. If NR1 and NR2 belong within Neanderthal variation, Their later absence at this site is merely a gap in a wider Neanderthal history. Conversely, if the fossils represent a distinct Levantine paleodeme, the disappearance of its recognizable form becomes a more specific evolutionary event. The ending depends upon the beginning. Classification determines what observers think has been lost. Culture offers no simple substitute for missing bones. Levallois methods continued across the region, but a technical tradition can outlive the population that practiced it, pass between groups, or be reinvented. Shared knowledge may preserve an echo of contact without preserving biological ancestry. A later napper following a comparable sequence is not automatically a descendant of the Unit 6 artisans. Yet the persistence of related methods warns against imagining total erasure. People can vanish as a named anatomical category, while parts of their learned world continue in other hands. Competition with Homo sapiens is often invoked in stories of archaic disappearance, but Nesher Ramla does not preserve a contest with a winner. Early Homo sapiens had occupied the Levant before and around this broad period, and later populations moved through again. Overlap could produce rivalry, avoidance, exchange, or intermarriage. Different outcomes may have occurred in different generations. Nor should Homo sapiens be treated as an inevitable advancing force. Populations expanded, retreated, and sometimes disappeared locally. Survival was contingent, not proof of superiority. The most accurate ending is therefore unresolved. After Unit 6, the known individual passes beyond recognition. The population may have declined, moved, merged, been reclassified, or experienced some combination of all four. What vanished first was not necessarily a people, but our ability to see them clearly. That distinction leaves a quieter legacy. Nesher Ramla enlarges the number of ways a human population can disappear from history. Extinction is only one. A lineage can survive biologically while its anatomy dissolves into a broader population. Its techniques can travel without its genes. Its descendants can remain present under a name created for someone else. To decide whether this happened, researchers must return to the scattered Levantine fossils and ask which fragments belong together, which similarities are ancestral, and whether the missing population is truly absent or merely hidden inside the categories already in use. To search for a population hidden inside old categories, researchers must reopen cases that seem to have names already. The Levant has produced human fossils for more than a century, but many are isolated teeth, partial jaws, or broken skulls. They were discovered under different excavation standards and compared with different samples. Some entered textbooks as early modern humans, others as Neanderthals or Homo heidelbergensis. Nesher Ramla asks whether those assignments describe biological identities or merely the closest available museum drawer. Kesem Cave offers the oldest candidates in the proposed regional sequence. The cave, east of modern Tel Aviv, was used during the Achulo-Yabrudian cultural complex, broadly between about 420,000 and 200,000 years ago. Its human evidence consists of teeth rather than a face or cranial vault. Permanent and deciduous teeth show combinations compared with both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, while some retain generalized characteristics. Because the specimens come from different levels and represent several individuals, they need not belong to one biological population. A tooth preserves valuable details in its crown, roots, enamel thickness, and internal junction between enamel and dentine. Some features are strongly patterned among populations, and teeth often survive where bone dissolves. Yet an isolated premolar cannot reveal the rear skull preserved at Nesher Ramla, and the Nesher Ramla jaw contains no teeth for direct comparison with Kizum. Linking them requires comparison across different anatomical regions. The connection is therefore indirect. Both samples resist familiar categories and may preserve traits compatible with long regional ancestry. Farther north, the fragment from Zutia Cave has carried almost a century of changing identities. Discovered in 1925, it preserves much of the frontal bone and part of the upper face. Its age is broad because the find emerged from an early excavation and cannot be tied to modern dating as securely as Nesher Ramla. Researchers have compared it with Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, and generalized ancestors of later populations. Its anatomy resists the complete derived pattern of any one group. For supporters of the Nesher Ramla paleodeme, Zutia supplies a possible face from an earlier chapter. Its robust brow region and comparatively generalized facial form might belong to the same long-lived Levantine population that later produced NR1 and NR2. But the match is not a physical join. Zutia lacks the rear cranial structures and mandible central to the Nesher Ramla diagnosis. Nesher Ramla lacks the corresponding forehead and face. The two fossils resemble one another across an interpretive gap. They may be relatives or separate survivors of broadly ancestral anatomy. Tabun Cave makes the puzzle denser. Its long sequence on Mount Carmel contains many occupations and at least 2 famous human finds. Tabun C1 is a partial skeleton usually treated as Neanderthal, though its age and exact stratigraphic position have generated debate. Tabun C2 is a robust isolated mandible, recovered lower in Layer C. It has often been assigned to early Homo sapiens, but other analyses find that it does not sit comfortably within either modern human or Neanderthal variation. That uncertainty makes a link with Nesher Ramla tempting. Yet Tabun exposes the danger of building a lineage from disputed pieces. The cave was excavated before current methods of 3-dimensional recording, sediment analysis, and direct dating. Layers formed over long spans and were affected by natural processes. A label can change when a fossil's position is reconstructed or a new comparative sample is used. Tabun C2 differs from NR2, including in aspects of the front of the jaw, interpreted as more Homo sapiens-like. Placing both in one paleodeme may enlarge its variation, but can also make the hypothesis difficult to disprove. The problem resembles drawing a constellation. Each fossil is a real point, fixed imperfectly in anatomy, place, and time. Lines between them can create a coherent figure, but another observer may connect the same points differently. Chasem, Zutie, Tabun, and Nesher Ramla form an appealing sequence because they occupy one broad corridor and resist simple classification. Still, geographic proximity across hundreds of thousands of years is not population continuity. The Levant was a passageway precisely because newcomers repeatedly entered it. A valid paleodeme should do more than collect anomalies. Researchers would expect a recurring combination of traits, reasonable chronological continuity, and an evolutionary pattern that explains change without absorbing every contradiction. More complete fossils could test those expectations. A skull preserving the face and rear vault would be especially valuable, as would a mandible with teeth securely associated. If such specimens repeatedly combine the features now divided among sites, the proposed population would become concrete. If they sorted into Neanderthal and Homo sapiens ranges, the category might dissolve. Sample size remains the quiet force behind the disagreement. Living populations contain extensive variation, including individuals outside the average in several measurements. Fossil groups are represented by so few bodies that one unusual individual can appear to define a lineage. Sex, age, development, disease, and ordinary inheritance influence shape. Researchers attempt to account for them, but fragments limit what can be corrected. The difference between population signal and individual variation may remain invisible until more fossils appear. There is no requirement that a regional population remain anatomically unchanged. If related people occupied the Levant from Kesem to Nesher Ramla, hundreds of thousands of years separate them. Gene flow, isolation, and local selection would alter their descendants. A hypothesis demanding identical morphology would be unrealistic. One permitting unlimited change would be empty. The challenge is to specify which traits carry shared ancestry and which reflect broader Middle Pleistocene variation. For now, these fossils are candidates rather than a recovered dynasty. Kesem may preserve early members of the proposed Paleodeme. Zoutier may preserve part of its face, and Tabun C2 may record a later neighbouring expression. Each may performs essential work. None can be assigned through proximity alone, and none provides the missing genetic link. The group exists as a testable arrangement of evidence, not a row of confirmed ancestors. That arrangement nevertheless changes the questions asked of old collections. Bones once treated as inconvenient outliers can be scanned again, their internal structures measured, their sediments redated, and their histories compared without assuming that only two populations were available. Even a failed connection is informative. If Zoutier or Tabun C2 proves unrelated to Nesher Ramla, the Levant becomes more diverse, not less. The search therefore moves from naming fossils to finding evidence that can connect them independently of external shape. Ancient DNA would be decisive if it had survived, but warm environments make that hope uncertain. Proteins, microscopic structures, and chemical traces may carry weaker signals across greater time. The next chapter of Nesher Ramla may emerge not from another dramatic jaw, but from molecules hidden inside fragments excavated generations ago. Before imagining what those methods might reveal, however, their limits must remain as visible as their promise. The most decisive evidence may be too small to see. Molecules inside bone, tooth, or sediment can preserve relationships that external shape leaves uncertain. A Nesher Ramla genome could test whether the fossil individual clustered with Neanderthals belonged to a separated Levantine population or carried ancestry from several sources. It could determine genetic sex and perhaps show whether NR1 and NR2 came from one person. Yet as of August 2026, no ancient DNA from either fossil has been published. The solution remains an experiment not yet achieved. Time is only one obstacle. DNA breaks apart after death, and heat accelerates its destruction. Cold caves and permafrost have yielded old genomes because low temperatures slowed that process. Nesher Ramla offered almost the opposite setting, a warm open-air depression exposed to changing moisture, microbes, and climatic cycles. Bone may survive as mineral while its genetic information disappears. A fossil does not guarantee a genome. Dense skeletal regions sometimes protect more endogenous DNA. Teeth may retain genetic material, while enamel shelters proteins. NR2 includes 1 molar, making it precious for more than its shape. But sampling carries a cost. Powder drilled from a tooth or cranial fragment cannot be returned. A failed extraction can consume irreplaceable material without producing information. Conservators must weigh success against future methods that may need less. Before destructive sampling, laboratories can screen preservation through imaging, spectroscopy, or minute tests. If DNA is recovered, age alone does not authenticate it. Modern DNA can arrive through excavation, handling, storage, and laboratory work. Genuine fragments are normally short and chemically damaged, but those signatures require controls and replication. A few Neanderthal-like sequences would not constitute a genome. They might represent contamination, ambiguous alignment, or another source in the deposit. Even a high-quality genome would answer narrower questions than headlines imply. It could estimate affinities and gene flow, revealing ancestry related to known Neanderthals or an unsampled lineage. It could not recover the person's language, memories, group name, or cultural identity. Nor would similarity settle the species debate. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred while maintaining recognizable histories. Taxonomy would still require interpretation. Sediment offers another archive. People shed biological traces into the places they use, and scientists have retrieved archaic human DNA from cave deposits without identifiable human bone. In the Levant, Sephonim cave sediments preserved animal mitochondrial DNA in layers roughly 30,000 to 70,000 years old, showing that favorable conditions can exceed expectations. But Sephonim is sheltered. The fossil layer at Nesher Ramla is older and formed in an exposed depression. Sedimentary DNA also loosens the connection between molecule and body. Water can move fragments vertically or horizontally. Animals can contribute material, and repeated occupations can mix biological signals. If Neanderthal-like DNA appeared in Unit 6 sediment, researchers would have to establish that it was ancient, local, and stratigraphically secure. Even then, it might come from another visitor rather than the individual represented by the jaw. Sediment could reveal a population's presence while failing to assign ancestry to NR1 or NR2. Proteins may endure where DNA has vanished. Enamel proteins contain amino acid variations that can inform evolutionary relationships and genetic sex. By 2026, researchers had recovered informative proteins from 400,000-year-old Middle Pleistocene Homo erectus teeth in China. Such success makes a molecular test at Nesher Ramla conceivable. But proteins provide a thinner record than a genome. Enamel contains only a restricted set, and many protein sequences are shared across closely related populations. A successful analysis might show that the Nesher Ramla molar belongs within a Neanderthal-related branch without distinguishing a distinctive Levantine paleodeme from southern Neanderthal variation. It might determine sex, yet reveal nothing about recent mixture. Proteins also degrade, undergo chemical modification, and suffer contamination. Their endurance is greater, not unlimited. The single molar anchors comparison, so molecular sampling would trade one kind of evidence for another. Newer extraction techniques can reduce the amount removed, but they cannot make the decision harmless. The question is not simply whether a test can be performed, but whether its value justifies altering the specimen. Other methods work without molecules. High-resolution computed tomography reveals cortical thickness, tooth roots, mandibular canals, and internal bone organization. Three-dimensional morphometrics can compare the pieces with large samples, while virtual refitting tests whether fragments align. These approaches may refine which traits are primitive or shared with Neanderthals. They cannot manufacture the missing face. A digital reconstruction remains a hypothesis constrained by preserved anatomy. Chronology can also be sharpened. Unit 6 is dated through converging methods applied to associated teeth, heated flint, minerals, and sediments, including electron spin resonance combined with uranium series analysis, thermoluminescence, and luminescence dating. Additional measurements and improved models could narrow the interval or expose movement between layers. Directly dating human bone would be desirable, but uranium enters and leaves fossil tissue through complicated histories. A precise number can be misleading if the material behaved as an open chemical system. Better dates would clarify overlap with Homo sapiens sites, but not prove an encounter. More detailed residue and use-wear studies could reconstruct how edges worked animal or plant materials, while refitting and microstratigraphy could separate individual visits. Those advances would improve the behavioral story, yet a stone flake would still lack a biological signature. Methodological precision does not dissolve the difference between association and authorship. The greatest breakthrough may therefore come from another fossil, a securely dated skull preserving face, vault, jaw, and teeth, could test whether the Nesher Ramla mosaic recurs in one individual. Several such finds could distinguish a population pattern from unusual anatomy. New remains might emerge from old collections, undiagnostic bone fragments identified by protein screening, or excavations at another Levantine site. The original depression, partly exposed through quarrying, cannot be treated as an unlimited archive waiting to surrender every answer. Science advances here through restraint as much as intervention. Researchers preserve material for techniques not yet invented, record exactly what a sample destroys, and allow a negative result to remain negative. No DNA is not evidence that Nesher Ramla people were genetically isolated. No protein is not evidence that they lacked descendants. Absence can reflect heat, water, microbes, excavation history, or simple bad fortune. Until a molecular signal survives scrutiny, the jaw and parietal fragments must carry an argument larger than their size. They show why anatomy, technology, geography, and time cannot be forced into one verdict. The desired answer may arrive as a short peptide, a damaged sequence, or another bone found beyond the quarry. But even before it arrives, Nesher Ramla has already changed the shape of the question. Human evolution in the Levant looks less like a row of species replacing one another and more like a braided current, separating, rejoining, and carrying fragments of ancestry and knowledge across boundaries. That wider pattern is the legacy the fossils can reveal without a genome. The absence of DNA from Nesher Ramla does not leave the fossils outside the genetic story. It places them at its edge. Genomes recovered from Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, and living people have transformed the old image of separate human species replacing one another without contact. They reveal repeated mixture across Eurasia, yet none contains a sequence labelled Nesher Ramla. The genetic evidence can show what kinds of encounters occurred in the wider human world. It cannot identify the unisic individual as a participant. The clearest signal survives in people alive today. Most present-day populations with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small proportion of Neanderthal-derived DNA, usually around 1 to 2%, though the amount and segments vary. This inheritance proves that ancestors of later Homo sapiens populations had children with Neanderthals and that some descendants survived. It does not mean each living person is 1 or 2% Neanderthal in any simple anatomical sense. The inherited fragments are scattered portions of genomes, filtered through thousands of generations. Recombination explains why those fragments can act as clocks. Each generation shuffles chromosomes, breaking long inherited segments into shorter pieces. A child of a recent Neanderthal ancestor would carry long blocks. After many generations, those blocks become smaller and more dispersed. By measuring their lengths and comparing genomes, researchers estimate when mixture occurred. Analyses of early Eurasian people and present populations place the major shared contribution to the ancestors of non-Africans broadly around 50,000 years ago, with recent work narrowing an important interval to approximately 49,000 to 45,000 years ago. That episode happened tens of thousands of years after the Nesher Ramla fossils were deposited. It cannot explain NR1 or NR2 directly. Its importance lies elsewhere. It demonstrates that reproductive boundaries between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were permeable. Populations recognized as anatomically different could produce descendants whose ancestry continued. What was once treated as a speculative possibility is now a measurable part of human genomes. The mixture was not confined to one event. A roughly 40,000-year-old individual known as OES1 carried unusually long Neanderthal segments, indicating a Neanderthal ancestor only several generations earlier. At Bacho Kiro Cave, approximately 45,000-year-old Homo sapiens individuals also had recent Neanderthal ancestors in their family histories. Some early populations contributed ancestry to later people. Others seem to have left little detectable genetic legacy. Contact therefore did not produce one uniform blended population. It occurred among communities with different demographic futures. More distant signals may approach the time of Nesher Ramla. Some genomic models identify gene flow from early populations related to Homo sapiens into Neanderthals long before the major late episode in the opposite direction. A 2024 analysis proposed recurrent contributions, including an older interval around 250,000 to 200,000 years ago, and a smaller interval around 120,000 to 100,000 years ago. The second overlaps the closing edge of the broad Nesher Ramla chronology closely enough to attract attention, but an estimated interval is not a map coordinate. The signal was inferred by comparing the genomes of living humans with a few sequenced Neanderthals from Europe and Siberia. It does not identify the Levant as the location of mixture, and it does not name the population providing the Homo sapiens-related ancestry. Dating depends on models of mutation, recombination, population size, and separation. Different assumptions can shift estimates. The overlap with Nesher Ramla makes contact conceivable, not proven. Direction matters as well. Neanderthal ancestry in later Homo sapiens records movement from Neanderthal populations into modern human descendants. Homo sapiens-related ancestry inside Neanderthal genomes records movement the other way. Over deep time, both directions may have occurred repeatedly. This reciprocity fits a corridor in which populations expanded, retreated, met, and separated. It does not establish that every population in the corridor participated, or that biological exchange accompanied every shared stoneworking tradition. Could Nesher Ramla people have contributed to one of these signals? They occupied the right broad region and carried Neanderthal-related anatomy, while nearby Homo sapiens populations existed within overlapping times. If they belonged to a distinctive Levantine paleodeme, their ancestry might have entered Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, or both. If they were southern Neanderthals, mixture detected elsewhere could belong to the wider history of their lineage. Each possibility is compatible with some evidence. None can be selected without a molecular reference from Nesher Ramla or a securely related fossil. The phrase ghost population can make the missing group sound more definite than it is. In genetics, a ghost is an unsampled ancestral population required or favoured by a model. It may be known from no genome and no confidently assigned skeleton. Nesher Ramla is almost the reverse bones without a genome. Joining the two absences is tempting, But one mystery does not automatically solve another. A statistical branch cannot be attached to a jaw because both lack a familiar name. Even if future DNA connected Nesher Ramla to an inferred contribution, ancestry would not settle anatomy or culture. Genes recombine, traits develop through complex interactions, and learned behavior follows different routes. A population may transmit techniques without having children with its neighbors, or exchange partners without adopting every practice. The Levallois similarities at the site and the genomic evidence for mixture across Eurasia support a world of permeable boundaries, but they remain independent lines of evidence. The same distinction matters to the disappearance described earlier. A small population may vanish as a recognizable body form while portions of its ancestry persist inside larger groups. Conversely, interbreeding can occur repeatedly while a lineage still leaves almost no descendants. OACE-1 demonstrates how a person can possess a recent Neanderthal ancestor, yet belong to a population with little detectable contribution to later Europeans. Mixture is not the same as demographic survival. Genetics therefore changes the standard of plausibility, but not the verdict at Nesher Ramla. It makes strict, permanent isolation between named human groups increasingly difficult to assume. It shows that contact could be intimate, recurrent, and biologically consequential. At the same time, the missing genome enforces a boundary. We cannot claim that the unicissic individual interbred with Homo sapiens, contributed to Neanderthals, or survives in anyone alive today. What the genes provide is a surrounding pattern. Human lineages met more often than older evolutionary trees allowed, and their descendants carried pieces of those meetings far beyond the places where they occurred. Nesher Ramla stands within that patterned world as an unresolved participant. Its fossils may represent a branch that exchanged ancestry, a regional form within an already connected lineage, or a population whose genetic contribution disappeared. Before the final legacy can be measured, the story must return to the bones, stones, and landscape together, and ask what has truly changed since two fragments emerged from the quarry. The discovery of Nesher Ramla changed more than the list of humans who occupied the Levant. It changed the endings considered when a fossil form disappears. The regional story once seemed reducible to movements of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. An archaic population surviving until roughly 140,000 to 120,000 years ago introduces another possibility. Groups may pass out of visibility, not through one final extinction, but through movement, mixture, and the changing boundaries by which fossils are classified. After Unit 6 accumulated, Southwest Asia did not settle into demographic calm. Rainfall belts shifted, woodlands expanded and contracted, and deserts alternately narrowed and widened routes connecting Africa, Arabia, and Eurasia. A valley that supported gazelle, horses, and human camps in one interval might become unreliable in another. Communities followed water and prey, abandoned familiar places, or met populations arriving along newly usable corridors. Climate did not select one human type as a predetermined winner. It repeatedly rearranged the conditions under which small populations survived. The early Homo sapiens remains at school and Kafse belong to this unstable history. Their presence shows that people with substantially modern anatomy occupied the Levant during an interval approaching the age of Nesher Ramla. Their later absence from the local fossil record is a warning. Those early populations did not simply expand without interruption into all later Eurasians. Some may have retreated, declined, or contributed little ancestry. Even Homo sapiens could occupy the crossroads and then become archaeologically invisible. Later Neanderthals at Kibara, Amud, and other Levantine sites demonstrate another reversal. Populations with classic Neanderthal anatomy occupied the region tens of thousands of years after the Nesher Ramla specimens. Their presence could reflect movements from northern Eurasia, continuity within Southwest Asia, mixture with regional groups, or combinations of these processes. The fossils do not form a queue in which one population waits for another to leave. They are changing samples from a landscape through which ancestry moved in several directions. Against this background, a violent replacement of Nesher Ramla people is unnecessary and unsupported. No Unit 6 surface preserves combat between anatomically identified groups. Cut marks on animal bones document butchery, not warfare. Burned material documents fire, not community destruction. Competition for territory or prey remains possible wherever populations overlapped, but possibility cannot become a final battle. A slow demographic imbalance could erase a small population more effectively than open conflict and leave almost no archaeological signature. Numbers matter. A population spread thinly across the Levant might maintain distinctive ancestry while communities remained connected. If climate divided those communities, local groups could shrink. The arrival of modest numbers of neighbors could then transform ancestry over generations. No single encounter would resemble extinction. Children would be born, techniques exchanged, and camps reused. Yet after centuries, the traits seen in NR1 and NR2 might become rare enough to vanish from the tiny fossil sample available to science. Absorption is therefore not a gentler word for disappearance. It describes a different outcome. Individuals and families may continue while the statistical cluster recognized by researchers dissolves. Descendants need not know that a boundary has been crossed, because the boundary is drawn later from bones. If Nesher Ramla people mixed with Homo sapiens or Neanderthal-related communities, their biological history could persist after their recognizable morphology did not. Without their DNA, however, no segment in a later genome can be traced confidently to them. Departure produces the same visible silence by another route. Groups could have followed favorable environments north toward Anatolia, east into poorly sampled landscapes, or south along corridors whose deposits remain undiscovered. Migration would not require a coordinated exodus. Seasonal movement expanding over generations could gradually shift a population's center. The known fossil map is far too incomplete to follow such a change. A line from Nesher Ramla to any later site would express a hypothesis, not a recovered trail. The alternatives can also combine. Some communities may have moved while others remained. Those who stayed could have merged with newcomers. Isolated groups could have declined. Descendants elsewhere could have entered populations given different names. Evolutionary endings are rarely synchronized across an entire range. Asking for the one event that ended Nesher Ramla Homo may therefore be the wrong scale of question. A paleodeme can fragment into several histories, none preserving the original combination clearly enough to be recognized. Stone tools cannot choose among these futures. Prepared core methods continued in the Levant because knowledge could pass through teaching, observation, and shared tradition. That continuity may indicate contact, but it cannot show whose descendants survived. If a method associated with Unit 6 appeared later, its makers might be biological descendants, cultural heirs, or people who reached a similar solution. Culture can cross a boundary quickly. Ancestry changes through different processes. The persistence of technique is evidence against isolation, not proof of genealogy. The fossil record after Nesher Ramla is equally selective. A jaw with a chin may be called Homo sapiens. A robust skull with derived features may be called Neanderthal. Mixed or generalized remains are more likely to remain disputed or assigned to the nearest known category. If descendants of the Unit 6 population became anatomically intermediate, later classification could conceal rather than reveal them. The disappearance might partly occur inside scientific language, where uncertain fossils are separated into familiar groups because no secure Nesher Ramla reference sample exists. This does not mean every ambiguous Levantine fossil belongs to a hidden lineage. A hypothesis claiming all anomalies cannot be tested. Continuity requires recurring anatomical patterns, secure dates, and ideally molecular evidence. Until those appear, disappearance, absorption, and departure remain alternatives rather than stages in a confirmed story. The value of Nesher Ramla is not that it supplies a secret ancestor for every later population. It exposes how little evidence can create the illusion of a clean succession. By the time later Homo sapiens populations expanded through Southwest Asia, the human landscape had been shaped by many earlier occupations. Some lineages left genomes, some left tools, some left only isolated bones. The Nesher Ramla population may have contributed to that inherited world, or it may have ended without a detectable descendant. Both outcomes fit the present evidence. What cannot be restored is the old certainty that only named species crossed this region in orderly sequence. The silence after Unit 6 is therefore historical evidence, but not a witnessed ending. The final mystery is not simply where these people went. It is whether a human population must remain distinct in bones, genes, and tools for us to say it survived. Nesher Ramla suggests identities can fade while ancestry or knowledge continues, and absence from later categories is not erasure from history. This prepares the story for its widest view, a human family whose borders produced differences, yet remained permeable enough that no branch can be understood entirely alone. The human family is often drawn as a tree because a tree makes descent visible. The image remains useful, but Nesher Ramla exposes what it leaves out. Populations can separate and meet again. Migrants can enter an established region, exchange ancestry or knowledge, and then disperse. A branch can contribute to another without surviving as a recognizable line. In the Levant, human evolution may have resembled a network growing through time more than a set of sealed limbs. That does not mean the differences among ancient humans were imaginary. Neanderthals developed a distinctive anatomical and genetic history. Homo sapiens likewise emerged through populations with their own shared ancestry. The Nesher Ramla fragments possess a real combination of features that requires explanation. If every fossil were dissolved into one endlessly variable humanity, the pattern would become impossible to study. The challenge is to recognize difference without treating every difference as an impermeable wall. Species names help researchers organize that challenge. A name allows fossils to be compared, hypotheses to be stated, and disagreements to become testable. But species are not labels preserved inside bone. Researchers infer them from anatomy, chronology, geography, and, when available, molecules. Different species concepts emphasize different criteria. Reproductive definitions are difficult to apply to extinct populations. Morphological definitions depend on deciding how much variation is enough. Evolutionary definitions require reconstructing lineages from an incomplete record. This is why the phrase Nesher Ramla Homo was deliberately cautious. It identified a distinctive set of remains and proposed a regional population without immediately declaring a new species. That restraint preserved several possibilities: a previously unrecognized paleodeme, an early or southern Neanderthal form, or a population connected to more than one lineage. The phrase is less dramatic than a new Latin name, but scientifically it can be more useful. It tells us where the evidence begins and where interpretation remains open. The fossils also warn against equating a primitive feature with a primitive person. The absence of a modern chin or the form of a cranial vault describes anatomy, not intelligence, social complexity, or evolutionary worth. Unit 6 contains organized stone production, repeated fire use, effective hunting or carcass processing, and detailed knowledge of animal bodies and raw material. None of those activities requires the makers to fit comfortably within a familiar taxonomic box. Their lives were not transitional merely because their bones appear intermediate to us. Nor should mosaic anatomy be understood as a failed attempt to become something else. Evolution does not work toward a predetermined modern form. Features change at different rates under the influence of ancestry, drift, selection, development, and gene flow. A population can retain ancient-looking traits while acquiring others shared with later groups. The resulting combination is not evolutionary confusion. It is what descent through changing connected populations can produce. The same principle extends beyond Nesher Ramla. Middle Pleistocene fossils across Africa and Eurasia often resist assignment because the period was populated by groups whose samples are painfully small. Homo heidelbergensis, archaic Homo sapiens, early Neanderthal, and other labels sometimes gather remains that may not form natural units. New discoveries repeatedly force those collections to be divided or recombined. Nesher Ramla does not solve that broader disorder, but it makes premature simplicity harder to defend. Its location is central to that lesson. The Levant was neither an empty bridge nor a waiting room between continents. It contained habitable landscapes in which communities could remain for long periods, adapt locally, and encounter travelers. The region could create continuity and interruption at once. A fossil found there may record a resident, a newcomer, a descendant of earlier contact, or all three across its ancestry. Technology reveals another kind of permeability. The unisnappers followed prepared core methods comparable to those used by contemporaneous Homo sapiens. That similarity may reflect contact, shared inheritance, convergence, or combinations of them, whatever the root. It undermines the assumption that each anatomy carried an exclusive technological package. Stone traditions belong to communities of learning. They can cross biological boundaries, change within a population, and disappear while the people continue. This distinction changes how a human encounter should be imagined. Two groups meeting in the Levant would not arrive as scientific categories aware of their position on a family tree. They would encounter bodies, gestures, sounds, tools, territories, and intentions. Difference could matter greatly, yet recognition, hostility, curiosity, alliance, and kinship were social possibilities rather than outcomes dictated by skull shape. Archaeology cannot reconstruct a conversation at Nesher Ramla, but genetics elsewhere shows that some encounters ultimately entered family histories. Still, the desire to humanize the past can produce another form of overconfidence. We cannot give the Unit 6 individual a face that the fragments do not preserve, assign beliefs to the fires, or turn shared technology into friendship. We cannot say whether this person met Homo sapiens, spoke with another population, or belonged to the group that made every artifact nearby. Respect for ancient humanity includes respecting the distance between evidence and imagination. What can be said is substantial. Between roughly 140,000 and 120,000 years ago, an individual with an unusual combination of archaic and Neanderthal-related features, was deposited among evidence of human activity at Nesher Ramla. The site records sophisticated Levallois stone production, animal exploitation, fire, and repeated occupation. The anatomy challenges a two-population account of the Levant. The proposed paleodeme offers one explanation, while assignment within Neanderthal diversity offers another. No published DNA yet decides between them. Those limits do not weaken the discovery, they define its importance. A fossil can transform a field without receiving a permanent name or a confirmed place in a pedigree. NR1 and NR2 force researchers to reopen old collections, test regional models, separate culture from anatomy, and take mixture seriously without claiming it prematurely. Their power lies not in completing the human family tree, but in revealing where the tree has been drawn too cleanly. The mystery, therefore, survives in a more disciplined form. It is no longer simply the question, what species was this? It asks how long a distinctive population history can persist, how anatomy changes through contact, how knowledge moves among communities, and how an evolutionary lineage disappears from recognition. Each possible answer carries different implications, and none should be selected because it makes the most satisfying story. As the quarry grows quiet in imagination, the fragments remain where all careful inquiry ends between knowledge and uncertainty. They are enough to show that another human history occupied the crossroads, yet not enough to tell us its name or fate. One final return to that ancient landscape can now bring the investigation to rest, not by solving what the fossils withhold, but by seeing clearly what their silence has taught us about belonging to a human family that was always larger, stranger, and more connected than its surviving branch. Return once more to the hollow at Nesher Ramla, before the quarry, before sediment hardened around bone and stone. Evening is settling over the central Levant, the light leaves the limestone hills, and the depression gathers shadow. Somewhere near its floor, a fire burns low. It does not illuminate a species or a branch on an evolutionary tree. It illuminates hands, flakes of flint, animal bones, and faces that the earth will not preserve. The people beside that fire do not know that their remains will become a question. They have no names like archaic, Neanderthal-related, or Nesher Ramla Homo. They know the paths to water, the seasons of gazelle, the places where good stone can be collected, and the gestures that pass skill between people. Their world is immediate. Hunger can be answered, an edge sharpened, a flame protected from wind, and tomorrow's movement considered. Around them lies a landscape unlike the 21st century quarry. Soil and vegetation cover what will later become deep deposits. Animals cross the basin and leave traces that people read with practiced attention. Rainfall varies, changing the balance of woodland and open ground. None of it is static, although slow change might make each lifetime feel rooted. The corridor between continents is not a line beneath their feet. It is simply home, even as distant populations move toward it. Tracks appear after rain and vanish beneath weather, reminding us how much of every day could disappear without reaching archaeology. Perhaps other humans occupy nearby valleys. Perhaps news of strangers travels through objects, absences, or encounters. Similar Levallois methods among populations suggest knowledge could move, but the route is gone. No surviving artifact records a teacher's name or the moment a technique was learned. A prepared core retains decisions in stone, yet it cannot preserve the teacher's voice. The fire offers warmth without revealing who was welcome beside it. The individual represented by NR1 and NR2 may be present in this imagined evening, though the link is uncertain. The jaw and cranial fragments may belong to the same person, but the evidence has not made the identification certain. We cannot know the individual's relationships or how the remains entered the deposit. Imagination can restore atmosphere. It cannot restore a biography. So the details begin to fall away. The face cannot be completed. The language cannot be heard. The ancestry remains beyond the reach of published DNA. Even the population's boundary shifts with the fossils compared and definition used. What remains firm is modest but real human remains with the distinctive anatomical mosaic were found in securely investigated deposits dating broadly between about 140,000 and 120,000 years ago, alongside a rich record of activity. That modest statement has carried us through a larger human past. It led backward toward Kesem, Zutiye, and contested fragments from Tabun. It opened routes north toward Neanderthal origins and south toward early Homo sapiens populations. It brought anatomy into conversation with stone technology, climate, migration, and gene flow. At every turn, the fragments widen the story while authorizing no single version. Their refusal is not emptiness. Uncertainty can mark the shape of surviving evidence. It distinguishes strong comparison, broad dating, and resemblance mistaken for descent. It prevents a population from being invented merely to fill a gap. At Nesher Ramla, uncertainty protects something valuable, the possibility that Middle Pleistocene humanity was more varied than the names now available to describe it. The old picture of the Levant as a narrow bridge becomes quiet here. A bridge exists only to be crossed, but people can dwell in a crossroads. They can return to useful places, retain local knowledge, and shape regional history for generations. Newcomers do not always erase residents. Residents do not always remain unchanged. A landscape between continents can preserve its populations while connecting them to worlds beyond. This is why the mystery matters even if the term Nesher Ramla Homo disappears. Future evidence may place the fossils within a wider Neanderthal lineage, strengthen the case for a distinct Levantine paleodeme, or reveal mixture poorly served by current categories. Any result would revise the name, but none would undo the discovery. The fragments have already demonstrated that the earlier map was incomplete. They have also changed the meaning of an ending. If the anatomical pattern is not recognized later, the people need not have vanished in a single event. Their communities may have divided, some may have moved, some declined, and some joined neighbors whose descendants carried different traits. Knowledge may have continued after ancestry faded. Ancestry may have continued after anatomy changed. Fossil silence can contain several kinds of survival. For a story seeking a lost population, this is an unusual resting place. There is no recovered kingdom, final refuge, or moment when the last member steps out of history. There are only traces thinning until our categories cannot follow them. The loss belongs partly to deep time and partly to the limits of recognition. We seek familiar forms because they are easier to name, while evolution leaves mosaics, gradients, and descendants unlike their beginnings. The record preserves only rare interruptions in that disappearance, brief points where matter endured long enough to meet the future. The fire in the depression is lower now. Stoneworking has stopped. Tools lie near scattered bones, and sounds beyond the light belong again to animals and wind. Whatever differences separated this community from others, its members experienced night beneath the same changing sky. They needed rest, safety, cooperation, and enough memory of the land to continue. Their anatomy made them distinctive. It did not make their lives less complete. Thousands of generations pass. Sediment covers the occupation surfaces, bone breaks, minerals enter, and quarrying cuts into the buried sequence. The discovery does not awaken the individual or release a complete message. It exposes carefully studied fragments that make an old certainty impossible to maintain. From two pieces of a person, a region becomes crowded again with possible populations and encounters. We can leave the quarry without choosing a final name. The jaw can remain a jaw. The parietal fragments retain their difficult features, and the stone tools testify to practiced minds without declaring their maker's ancestry. Questions remain beside them, not as failures, but as honest boundaries around what time has allowed us to know. Far behind us, the ancient fire disappears into darkness. The people of Nesher Ramla pass beyond sight as they did in the fossil record, not necessarily extinguished or securely traced, but folded into a human past whose paths crossed often. Their mystery rests beneath the stars with no final verdict. Yet one truth remains clear enough to carry into the quiet long before our surviving branch stood alone. Other humans knew this land, shaped its stone, gathered around its fires, and belonged completely to the world.